Now, Steven's team sent me a bio, and I don't know, it seemed a little bit long, so I picked out a few facts for you. First of all, I don't know how many people know this, but he published his first work at age 11 in Highlights magazine. Some of you may be a little too young to remember that one. And then as an undergraduate at Appalachian State University, he actually started a rock band that was signed to Arista Records, and that landed him in New York City. But he gave up the dream of the rock band. He's written for New York Magazine, New York Times, and The New Yorker, among many others. He's written books like Turbulent Souls, Confessions of a Hero Worshipper, and even wrote a children's book, The Boy with Two Belly Buttons. I'm still waiting for the sequel, the one with 3 belly buttons, but I guess we're still waiting because, oh, by the way, he was also the co-author of this little book called Freakonomics. And this, of course, became a book series. We had Super Freakonomics, Think Like a Freak, and they have sold more than 7 million copies in over 40 countries. He's also the host of Freakonomics Radio. Now, before we begin, I'd like to remind everyone to submit their questions because when we're done, we'll have some Q&A time. So, without further ado, the leader of the band, Steven and the Freakonomics, Mr. Steven Dubner.
Okay, thank you, Fritz, very much for that lovely welcome, and thank you all for having me and for tuning in today. You know, this pandemic has been terrible, but it's also been diverse. It's had a huge and diverse effect. You know, it kills some people. I happen to live in New York City where it's killed a lot of people. Others who would seem to be the same category are untouched by it. Similarly, in the economy, it's had a very diverse effect. Some industries crushed, others, even adjacent industries, are booming, and then some are dormant. Some lives are disrupted, and other lives are kind of made for social distancing. And my life, for instance, I say this a little bit guiltily, is kind of built for quarantining because I'm a writer and I do radio. Now, I will say my wife was sick. She apparently had the coronavirus early on in New York City. And that was a horrible, tough couple of weeks. But now she's better and I'm back to my normal, you know, pre-pandemic self, even though it's still the pandemic here. And what I mean by that is, you know, I live the life of a writer. So I don't know how many of you may be writers or have writers in your family, and you have to kind of ask what kind of person chooses to become a writer. So in my case, it was basically, you know, the kind of person who has no marketable skills at all in any other realm. So I know a little bit about what you all do. I've seen some data on your work and your industries. And, you know, the fact is that I'm not capable of making anything or fixing anything or figuring anything out. I'm not really very employable. I don't do well at meetings, you know, where you have to kind of learn to say what you're expected to say rather than what you're actually thinking. And I have a little bit of problem with that. So I'm not very employable, and I don't like people very much. So for me, a virtual address like this is just utopia, that I get to speak with you, but we don't actually have to see each other. So this is, you know, I've kind of built my life along these lines. And basically, I'll just describe my day very briefly. I get up, I greet my family. I like them okay. And then I walk to my office, which is where I'm sitting now. It looks like an apartment, which it is. It's just a one-bedroom apartment on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. And I then close the door, and then I just sit here for like 10, 12, 14 hours alone. And I just sit and read and think and write. And if the reading and the thinking go well, then I have something to write that day. And if it doesn't go that well, then I'm perfectly happy. I've had yet another day not around people. So that was a victory nonetheless. Lately, I've been reading a lot about, I'm very interested in the food supply. I've been interested in the food supply and agriculture generally, the economics of food for a long time, even before the pandemic, but this certainly exacerbated it. But I grew up on a little farm in upstate New York, a little kind of just a family farm. And I learned early on that agriculture is really hard. You need a lot of things to go right. And if one or two things goes wrong, it's a real problem. So to me, it's remarkable that our global agricultural system has progressed so much over the past really 100, 150 years. If you go back and look at the predictions, all the smartest people in the world, if you look 100 or 150 years ago, you'll see that all the predictions said that, there's no way, if the world keeps getting more populated, that we can grow enough food for everybody. There will be mass starvation. And they said that when the global population hit 1 billion. Then they said there's no way it'll get to 2 billion. When it hit 2, they said there's no way. People will starve to death. We can't grow that much food. Here we are now at 7.3 billion people. And remarkably, there's way more than enough food to feed that many people every day. Now, does that mean there's no famine in the world? No, it doesn't. But famine is almost always the result of some political or economic dysfunction, not the lack of food. There's so much food in this country. Look, we are a very wealthy country, but there's so much food in this country that we actually throw away about 40% of what we buy at retail. That's how plentiful food is. And so I'm in awe of all the different technology and knowledge and collaboration and so on that have produced that fact. And so I like to read about the economics of agriculture and food production and so on. And I was recently in my office here alone, happy, reading one of my favorite journals. Maybe it's one of your favorites too. It's called the Journal of Agricultural Economics. And I was reading this piece about, basically it was about the trends in meat consumption in the United States over the past 100 years, which I have to tell you are fascinating, to me at least, maybe not to you. So I won't go too much into it, but you get a little bit of frog's legs, you get a little bit of, like from pork to beef, mutton. Mutton was big before the Second World War, but then mutton was really wiped out after the Second World War, interestingly enough, mostly by the invention of nylon. Nylon created the need for much, much, much less wool. Wool comes from sheep. Mutton is the meat of mature sheep. So these sheep were kept around by the millions and millions and millions to produce wool. And then finally we ate them. That was mutton. Nobody really liked mutton very much, but it was, it was available. It was pretty affordable. But once nylon came along, all those sheep didn't need to be kept around for wool, therefore much less mutton. So like I said, the history of meat consumption in the US, fascinating. Take it from me. So anyway, the big trend here over the past 40 years has been that beef is no longer the unchallenged #1 meat in America, as it was for many, many, many years. It's now been just about equaled by poultry. Obviously, we all know a lot more chicken. We eat a lot more now than ever. But the kind of the secret or the surprise, entrant in the poultry consumption is turkey. So what happened with turkey was really interesting. And so I was reading this. We started to eat a lot more turkey starting about 30, 40 years ago. And, it used to be that we would only eat turkey once or twice a year when you'd roast a whole turkey for a holiday. But now we eat turkey sandwiches and so on. And so as I'm reading this journal article about meat consumption, I come across one statistic in like a half a sentence. And I don't know if you're like me, but you probably are. Sometimes you'll see just one number or one fact, or you'll hear one story, and it will just trigger something in you, and you'll be interested. And you want to know more, and then you want to dig and dig and dig. So that's what happened with this sentence. And what the sentence said was that roughly 99% of the turkey that is bred for consumption in the United States of America is the result of artificial turkey insemination. Okay, so I read that. My first thought was, yuck. Even though I grew up on a farm, I never really thought about turkeys having sex. Maybe you have, I had not. And now we find out they're actually not having sex. They're actually engaged in this artificial insemination process for reproduction, at least. Maybe there's some recreational sex, the article did not say. So anyway, I read this, I'm like, what's that about? Could it potentially be something of deeper interest? Again, this is how I spend my days. So I begin to look, I go to look some other data, again. So here's the thing. When you find a piece of data, a statistic in isolation, that may not mean very much. You have to put it in context. So I do what I think is the natural thing. I look for the chicken breeding data. And chickens, it turns out, the vast majority of them breed naturally, no artificial insemination. So again, the mystery deepens. Plus now, it's like a justice issue. Why are the chickens getting to have sex and the turkeys not? So I want to know more. So I begin to dig, make some phone calls, send some emails, look up some academic papers, talk to a bunch of biologists, ranchers, and so on. To make a very long story short, what I find out is the following. As I said, we used to not eat that much turkey in America. We started eating more for a variety of reasons, health, we liked it, and so on. But Americans particularly partial to the breast meat, white meat, which comes from the breast. And so, as in any supply and demand ecosystem, when the demand goes up, the suppliers, if they're able to, respond. And so the way that the turkey producers responded was by selecting different breeds of birds that had more breast meat and then selectively breeding them to have larger and larger and larger breasts. And so this is what gets to the mystery underlying all this. In the old days, if you ran a turkey ranch, you might have, two turkeys. Let's say this is Tom turkey with a kind of flat, scrawny chest with enough meat on that breast for like a couple of sandwiches. That's it. But now it's been bred to have a bigger and bigger and bigger breast. And here's like, let's say Jane turkey. And in the old days, they would come up to each other and maybe kiss, whatever turkeys would do, then maybe get it on, whatever. But now, because their breasts have been overbred so much to make all those turkey sandwiches for you and me, those two turkeys cannot physically get close enough to procreate, thus the need for artificial turkey insemination. So this is how I spend my days. You can probably understand now why I'm not very appealing in meetings, why I'm not very employable, but I've worked out a little racket here where I interview and spend time with people who are much, much, much smarter than I am and learn about what they're doing and then try to kind of translate that. Often it's academic research and I try to translate that into the world. So that's how I'm spending my day. Now you could say this turkey sex or non-sex story, that's a disgusting story and it's meaningless. And honestly, I couldn't argue with you that much. But I would say this, it does illustrate kind of two key components of everything we do with Freakonomics, which is data, use the data to try to understand the incentives that make people behave as they do. And really, it sounds obvious in retrospect, but the fact is that a lot of decisions that we make on an individual level, on a policy level, are not really driven by data. And it turns out that a lot of the incentives that people think they are responding to are not really the incentives that people are responding to. We all say that we want to do the, quote, right thing or the pro-social thing, the thing that's better for other people. But it turns out that if the incentives don't align with that we'll often do the more selfish thing, sometimes even the dishonest thing. And so what we try to do is use the data to understand the incentives that make people behave as they do. So over the last few months, as you can imagine, we've had our hands really full trying to make sense of this new world. Since COVID-19 has started to happen, we've done on Freakonomics Radio a steady diet of material around this pandemic and all the different economic and social components around it. Our show, for those of you who listen to our podcast, it's usually, each episode usually takes about 6 to 8 weeks to produce because there are many people interviewed, then we edit it and script it and so on. But in the last few months, we've just been like a news show, putting out a piece every week, a new piece every week. And it's different for us. We're trying to keep up. We're trying to keep the spirit of Freakonomics and focus on the data, not just opinion or whatnot. And we've explored things like whether COVID-19 will spark a Cold War between the US and China. We have looked at the food chain, the food supply chain in the US. And then coming up, the things that we're working on right now that I'm sure intersect with a lot of things that you all are thinking about right now is like, what is going to be the new reality? Like, how do we come back from this? How different will it be? What will be the same? What will be better? What will be worse? What are the predictable consequences? What are the very hard to predict consequences? A couple of the topics, the big topics that we're working on right now that I think are of general interest. One is about telemedicine or telehealth. You know, people who work in the field or who monitor the field have been kind of complaining or joking for like 30 years that, like, you know, the future of telehealth is tomorrow, but it's always been tomorrow. It's like just around the corner. And it never happens. It's starting to feel a little bit like driverless cars are starting to feel like it's ready, it's there, but why isn't it happening? COVID-19 happened, and all of a sudden, telemedicine is happening. It comprises the vast majority. For those of us who've had any sort of healthcare over the past few months, the vast majority of that has been virtual. That is essentially telehealth. So the implications of that are massive. From a health outcome perspective, we're going to look at what are the upsides and what are the downsides. You know, obviously you can say, well, if you're not getting personal, in-person medical treatment, might there be a lot of things that are missed? Of course, yes. On the other hand, if because you don't have to go somewhere physically at a particular time and often arrange to get off from work or to leave your family or so on, might it make you a little bit more likely to pursue healthcare? The answer to that is also yes. So you can see that this is going to be a massive, if it sticks. And the question of whether it sticks has a lot to do with the incentives again. Right now, the payment and regulatory incentives have changed overnight. Rules were put down, new rules were put up, but will we see those rules rolled back? We don't know, and it may be state to state. So I think that's going to be a fascinating topic to watch, and you know we'll be watching that closely and trying to write something or put out some radio shows on that. Another big topic we're looking at is reemployment, which is again a massive topic. We're going to hit an official unemployment rate of something like 20% soon. The unofficial rate is probably more like 40%. How does employment come back? Who gets to come back and in what capacity? Who doesn't? How much automation comes in to take over the jobs that were already leaning toward automation? So that is that again, hard to predict, but we're going to try to look at it. And another topic that's really complicated and tricky is about human density generally. You know, we live at this moment at a time in history where the greatest share of humans live in urban areas. More than any other point in history, more of us live in an urban area today than ever. Why? Apparently because we like it. The incentives that drive people, especially young people, to urban areas are pretty strong. There are more options. There are more amenities. There is less time spent in transportation. There's more density. We like the density. We like the surprise of density. When you walk out your front door in the city, you don't know who you'll encounter. Might be good, it might not be good. When you walk out the front door in a rural area, your options are kind of limited. It might be that neighbor, or, you know, a wild turkey coming across your lawn. Wild turkeys, by the way, do get to have sex, so good for them. But, you know, the density is a big problem now with a pandemic, and the same for universities, where density used to be a benefit, and now it's a detriment. So, again, thinking about how we make our way back and how it's different, how it may be better in some ways, how it may be worse in other ways. These are all the things we're concerned about. So I think the biggest message I have for you today, when you think about your life, your business, society generally, is this. It's a paradox, unfortunately. The paradox is we want to know how the future is going to unfold badly. We humans don't do well with uncertainty. We get stressed. We make really bad decisions under uncertainty. there are very few things about uncertainty that make humans better. The problem is, as much as we want to know what the future is, it turns out that humans are also pretty terrible at predicting the future. We're even worse than we think we are. Some of us are a little bit better than others. Most of us are really bad. How do I know this? We've actually done a lot of research on this. We once did a radio show, I guess it was, maybe a book chapter 2. It was called The Folly of Prediction. And we looked at the data on experts from 4 different areas. NFL pundits, people predicting the outcome of football games. Corn yields, so we talked to the USDA and a few others in that area. Stock markets, obviously that's a big area for prediction, and geopolitics. So in each case, what we did is we looked at the people who are supposedly best in those fields, making their predictions about what the future would hold in their fields, short, medium, and long term. And then we measured the outcome of their predictions versus what you might call chance or a coin flip. And it turns out that in all of those fields, the average pundit or expert was about as good as like a monkey with a dartboard. They're about as good as chance. Why then do we keep listening to these people? Well, because we want to know the future. But the other reason is that there are really strong incentives to make bold predictions. So just imagine the last time you watched, 5 minutes of CNN or MSNBC or CNBC or Fox News. If you have a position, an opinion that's kind of bold and out there, you're likely to get booked on one of those shows to tell the world what you think will happen. If your prediction is, it's a complicated subject, could go a lot of different ways. My best guess is that the future will probably be not that different from the past, but if X were to happen in very strong magnitude, I could see how things would be very different. If that's how you talk, you don't get on TV. If that's your argument, you don't get to write the op-ed for the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal. What they want are big, bold, brash predictions. I happen to know by looking at the data that those big, bold, brash predictions are almost always brutally wrong. But the incentives to keep making them remain strong because we don't typically punish people who make those predictions. We don't hunt them down. In some areas, in the stock markets, if you're betting real money and it's your own money, that's different. But in many cases, these predictions are coming with almost no skin in the game. You may remember, 8 or 10 years ago, there was this big news story. It was a preacher whose name was Harold Camping, who was predicting that the Earth was going to end in a fiery ball on a given date. It was actually a date in May, right around now, like May 21st or something. And, when I saw him, to me, I'm an adult, he looked like a kook. Like I'd seen this before. But at the time, I have kids. My son at the time was like 8 or 9 years old, and he was petrified because here was this authority figure, an adult, a minister, a reverend who wore a suit and tie, and he got on all the TV networks because they like that kind of thing. And he was explaining exactly how if you don't follow my religious teachings exactly and join my group, then you will be among the billions and billions who die in a fiery ball when the earth ends on May 21st or whatever. And only by joining my religious group will you survive it. And so again, to me, it sounded a little bit implausible, but my son was petrified, and he would come to me and say, "Dad, what are we doing about this? Like, this has to be stopped." And I would say, I remember it was so bad. I was trying to be good dad, but what I said was, son, no credible authorities give this threat any credence. It sounded like a very bad CIA briefing or something. It was terrible. And he was not placated at all. And he was really, scared about it. And he said, Dad, no offense, do you mind like calling up or writing to someone smarter than you and seeing if they know more? So he was right. There are a lot of people smarter than me. So I wrote to this guy who's a friend of mine, the smartest human I've ever encountered. His name is Nathan Myhrvold. He's a former chief technology officer at Microsoft, but it goes way beyond that. He runs an invention firm now, but he trained as an astrophysicist. He worked, did an internship or a fellowship maybe with Stephen Hawking. He has degrees in mathematical economics and astrophysics and all these other things. So I wrote to Nathan. I said, listen, my son, Solomon, who's a very peaceful kid, he thinks the world is going to end in this ball of fire. Can you explain why you think that won't happen from an astrophysics perspective? And Nathan Myhrvold, busy guy, takes time out of his day to write this lovely, very thorough email to Solomon to explain why it's not going to happen. And my son reads it and he was like, yeah, okay. Like he got it, but he was still petrified. And he would go to bed at night crying. And I, as a parent, I felt so horrible because as a parent, you want to protect your kids against the few risks that are really risky. But then like all the other things that you think aren't risky, you don't want your kids to worry about them. And I felt I was failing him. And then finally the day arrived, that May 21st or whatever. And it dawned beautiful and crisp and clear, kind of like today is in New York City. And I said to my kid, here we are. What do you think? We're still here. And he said, oh yeah. I was never that worried about it. I said, you liar. Like he had the false bravado of the 9-year-old who could act as if he wasn't scared. But then I said to him, so Solomon, what do you think should happen now? What do you think should happen to this guy, this man who went on TV and everywhere and riled up you and everybody else? And again, my son's a very peaceful kid. He said, oh yeah, Dad, that's easy. They should take him outside and shoot him. So you may not agree with the sentence in this case, but you can understand the impulse to punish people who tell us how terrible everything is going to be with no skin in the game, and how when things turn out to be not as terrible as we thought, that they're not around anymore to apologize or to back up. If you're lucky, they'll explain how their prediction wasn't really that bad. They'll say, well, circumstances changed. If they hadn't, my prediction would have been right. Well, of course, that's the point. Circumstances do change. That's why predicting is really hard. So as we think about where we are right now, a few months into this pandemic, and then we try to think about, what is the way back? I don't know. I can't tell you that. I'm certainly no smarter than the virologists and the epidemiologists and some of the economists and sociologists who've had a lot of experience studying this sort of thing in history and so on. But what I can tell you is that almost everything that you're thinking and hearing right now is probably fairly wrong. It's probably wrong in direction and it's wrong in magnitude. Does that mean it will be better than you fear? Probably, but I can't guarantee, only because we usually fear the worst. But then what does it look like? How different is it? Again, I don't know. The work that we're trying to do every day is to understand how things will be better, worse, different, and so on. So again, with telehealth, I know one thing that I'm interested in looking at is productivity when it comes to telehealth. If I want to go to a doctor, and these days there's so much healthcare. There's eye care, there's dental care, there's your generalist. As you get older, you might have specialists and so on. If I want to do any one of those in a given workday, that's, I'm living in New York City. That's like a 3-hour chunk out of my workday. That's the bulk of a workday, really, for a lot of people. If you can do that in 15 minutes from your home or office, how does that change the dynamic? So again, a lot of what we imagine about the future tends to not factor in the benefits that we get from technology and from people kind of getting smarter along the way. So I think the real lesson here is when you think about trying to predict your circumstances, like your industry, your family, what's going to be better, what's going to be worse. I think the best thing you can acknowledge is A, how little we can predict. B, try really, really, really hard to get as much data as you can so that you're not predicting based on emotion and whatnot. C, I would say have some humility about understanding that the world is more complicated than you. And D, I would say, is that one of the best things about reading history is that you do learn a lot from past lessons that can really be applied. So I'll give you an example in the realm of prediction. So let me describe something to you. This is something that we wrote in one of our books. This has to do with a very common problem in cities around the world, especially, as I mentioned, more and more people are choosing to live in cities. Here, I'll just read to you a paragraph. The main mode of transportation in these cities produced a slew of the byproducts that economists call negative externalities, including gridlock, high insurance costs, and far too many traffic fatalities. Crops that would have landed on a family's dinner table were sometimes converted into fuel, which drove up food prices and caused shortages. Then there were the air pollutants and toxic emissions, endangering the environment as well as individuals' health. We are talking, of course, about the automobile, aren't we? Actually, no, we're not. We are talking about the horse. So as it turns out, the horse, if you go back 100, 130 years ago, was one of the biggest problems in society and civilization, really. And again, it was a bit of a paradox in that cities were built on horsepower. Horses were used not just for transportation, but for a great deal of manufacturing and so on. The paradox was the cities couldn't grow bigger and bigger and bigger without more and more and more horses. The problem is that horses produce a lot of waste in the form of, obviously, manure and urine, but let's put aside the urine for just a minute. So, by the way, I bet when you logged on to this presentation, you had no idea you were going to get such scintillating topics as turkey sex and horse manure. But, you know, again, this is someone who spends all his time alone, so I don't have a very good social filter. So anyway, horse manure in cities was a huge problem. It was really a crippling issue. And it was bad on many dimensions. It was very bad for disease. It smelled. It looked bad. And if you think about it, a given horse produced about 25 pounds of manure a day. In New York City at the time, there were, I think, a little over 1 million people, but there were 200,000 horses. So that's 5 million pounds of manure a day. That's a lot of waste. So what do? Well, if you go back, you know, let's say, so the period I'm talking about when it was at its worst was probably around the turn of the 20th century. I may be off by 10 years either end. If you go back maybe 10 or 15 years, horse manure was not a big problem, even in cities, because cities were not yet as big, there were not yet as many horses, and there was therefore not as much manure, but also there was a robust market for horse manure. Cities were typically surrounded by farm areas, and farmers would pay to get that manure as fertilizer, because horse manure is a very, very, very good fertilizer. But as urban growth intensified, there came to be a glut of manure, and the price fell from positive to kind of neutral to negative, which means that you'd have to pay someone to get rid of your horse manure. Well, people weren't willing to pay to get rid of the horse manure. And again, this is a case where the incentives were not really aligned, because the people who, let's say you run a factory, you're reliant on, you have a stable of 100 horses, it's not really in your best interest to have to pay to dispose of the waste, right? So you would just try to leave it out on the street. So the incentives were not well aligned, and this glut was causing a lot of problems. So the best and brightest minds of America and elsewhere would gather to try to figure what they should do about what they called the horse manure problem. You know, should they tax manure? Should they fine people? Those were considered sort of, especially at the time, economically and politically unpopular, not viable. There was talk of trying to breed horses that didn't defecate as much. There was talk of horse diapers, which are not very practical because, again, 25 pounds of horse manure a day, it's a lot. Imagine how big the diaper would have to be. So it was so bad that one year, I think late 1890s, there was a conference of mayors who was meeting in New York City, mayors from around the world, because Paris had this problem, London had this problem. And they got together and they said, we have to address the horse manure problem. It was so bad that they were supposed to get together for several days. After they talked about their options, none of which were viable, they gave up after a day or two. And they said, we can't solve this problem. And it seemed as though the best predictions of that day were that the only solution was essentially for cities to kind of start to depopulate, that they couldn't get big without horses, but they couldn't live with the horse manure. And the only solution was to go back to this kind of sort of pre-industrial way of more rural life, which was not what people wanted. People loved cities. Cities were dynamic and efficient and so on. So all the predictions were very, very dire. And then, almost overnight, the problem was solved. It was solved by the electric streetcar and the gas-powered, the internal combustion engine that led to the automobile. It was such an unbelievable and such a welcome turnaround that it was hailed by everyone. Even the New York Times editorial page, which is considered these days a pretty liberal page in terms of the environment, the New York Times editorial page at the time hailed the automobile as an environmental savior, which, I mean, it makes sense. If you think about it, a horse, this is also an interesting lesson maybe between what certain researchers call observables and unobservables. I mean, we all know what they are. We don't think about it so much so. But an observable is something that you can get your eyes around or kind of get your head around, whereas an unobservable is something very similar that you can't see. So a good emotional example would be if I punch you in the face, that's an observable characteristic or an observable manifestation of my anger. But I can have a lot of anger that if I don't physically manifest itself, if I don't make it physically manifest, you can't see it. So that's the unobservable version. With horses, the manure, the waste was very observable. With automobiles, it was invisible. It was literally invisible, and it floated up into the sky, and it just went away, and it was thought to be this unbelievably great miracle, which is why the New York Times called the car the environmental savior, and it was. It was an amazing technology. Now, if you fast forward 100 years, there are some downsides. We now know that pollution is pretty bad. It's got some very deleterious short-term health effects. If you look at, for instance, one silver lining of COVID-19 has been that there's been much, much, much less air pollution. And if you look at the most polluted places in the world, if you look at China, for instance, there was one early study of China when China went on lockdown. At the time, there had been something like 4,500 deaths in China from COVID-19. But because of the amount of air pollution that was removed from the sky, there were public health scholars who estimated that that would save the lives of about 50,000 other people who are not going to die as a result of air pollution. That's not just old, sick people. It's also younger people, too. That's how damaging air pollution is. So if you look at it that way, COVID-19 just on the death rate level or on the death amount level, COVID-19 actually saved lives in China by cleaning up the air so much. So we know that pollution is really bad. We live with it because the benefits of transportation are huge. We also know that transportation pollution plays a role in climate change and global warming. And that's where you've got this huge, potentially devastating outcome. So what do you do about that? How do you try to predict the outcomes there and what we should be doing about that? Well, again, it's really hard. There are a lot of potential outcomes. There are a lot of potential technologies that may change things. It's hard to say. But look, anybody who is at all a serious person has to think hard about the possibility that the pollution that we've been producing for the past 150 years or so could have really long-term deleterious effects. the economist Marty Weitzman, a renowned environmental economist from Harvard, he did a very extensive calculation. He argued that there was a roughly 5% chance that global temperatures would rise enough to, quote, effectively destroy planet Earth as we know it. 5% chance. So that's his prediction. You could say 5% is not 50%, it's not 90%, but 5% chance of total obliteration? That sounds pretty bad. So what do we do about that? How do we assess that risk against the uncertainty? Again, it's hard. I can't tell you the answer to that. What I can tell you, what I would say I would take away from this lesson, this parable of the horse manure, if you will, I would say there are 4 things that are worth thinking about when you're trying to predict now something like either climate change or how your life, your industry, your community are going to come back after the pandemic. I'll tell you these 4 things that I think are worth knowing, and then we'll move to questions after that. The first thing is a reminder. Number 1, you can't predict the future very well. So the best thing to do is get a grip on what you can understand about the future, get as much data as you can, and be humble about it. Number 2, technology is constantly creating opportunities that we fail to anticipate. Very few of us, if you had asked us 20 years ago, would predict that we would all be carrying around now every day in our pocket or purse, basically a supercomputer that's capable of doing many, 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 many things. Now, you also run into the human psychological response of habituation or accommodation, which is you get used to these technological advances and you immediately take them for granted and want more. So 5 years ago, we were like, oh my God, I can watch Netflix on my phone at work. And now we're like, why don't all my email and media accounts all sync simultaneously on all 19 of my devices? We get very used to technology. We want more immediately. But the fact is that technology is always creating opportunities we can't foresee. Therefore, we look at a current problem, we see the problem sustaining, but we don't see the corresponding technologies to help address them. And that's why we often overestimate how bad the future will be. So that's number 2. Number 3 is that change often comes from surprising places. So it wasn't the horse industry, and it wasn't the government either, really, that fueled the innovation that drove the inventions, in this case, the electric streetcar and the automobile. So we like to think that the realm where the problem is created is also the realm where the problem must be addressed and solved. It's not necessarily. So change often is positive, and it comes from outside the realm of where you're looking. And I think the 4th important thing to think about, the parable of the horse manure, is just the really interesting notion of how value can be created and destroyed and then created again, maybe even all surrounding the same product. So with the pandemic, you're thinking about, if you go back a few hundred years ago, human density was considered very dangerous. There were a lot of infectious communicable diseases, and there were no antibiotics. So people knew that going around other people was a danger. Then we got really good at medicine. That's why life expectancy has risen so much. It's not really the things that keep us alive from 50 and onward. We haven't done that well in that realm. It's the things that don't kill you by the time you're 15. So infectious disease, communicable disease, we've done unbelievably well with those, with things like clean water, but also antibiotics and so on. So, density used to be a negative. Then medicine got better, density became a huge positive. That's why we see so many people living in urban areas now. But all of a sudden, a new pandemic, human density may be a detriment again. So value can rise, fall, and rise again with the same thing. But it can also, it also rose and fell and has risen around a different commodity that I'm thinking of, not density, but horse manure. So I mentioned to you that, before cities got so big, before there was this glut of horse manure, there was actually a strong positive value, so much that farmers would buy it and truck it from the cities to their farms. then it fell to zero, then negative, so you had to pay somebody. Well, the good news is I'm happy to report that the value of horse manure has actually risen again to a strong positive. Now, there are two big reasons. One is gardening is the #1 outdoor activity in America, and horse manure is, as I said, a really, really good fertilizer. And #2, the supply of horses has fallen a lot. So, it's just a supply and demand thing. There's still a lot of horses in this country, but they're not used anywhere near as much, obviously. They're used mostly for recreation. And so there's less manure to go around. There's strong demand. That means the price has risen so high. And the price of horse manure has gotten so high. So this is always a good indicator. A commodity is in good demand when people, like regularly law-abiding people, are willing to steal it. So like one good measure of this is you can always tell something about the price for different metals for recycling if you put a kitchen appliance out in your front stoop or back, whatever you have, for recycling. If it's gone before the recycling truck gets there, that like aluminum prices are really, really doing well, right? If people are stealing your trash. Similarly, there was a case outside of Boston not so long ago where someone was arrested for stealing horse manure from a farm. So it happened that someone drove up to this farm. There was a big pile of horse manure. He filled up the back of his pickup truck and drove off. And the owner of the farm reported this to the police, and they found the thief. He lived very close by, as it turns out. And they came up to him and they said, why'd you steal the manure? We got a report for your arrest. And he said, no. I didn't steal it. I have an arrangement with that landowner. We've had it for years that every spring I go and get one truck full of manure from his farm for my flower beds. And it turns out that there was a new owner. The farm had been sold and the guy didn't even know it. And the new owner was kind of ticked, and he said, no, that manure is worth a lot of money. And he told the police to tell him, if he gives me like $300, it's okay, you can have it. And the guy who'd stolen it was like, there's no way I'm going to pay $300. I've been getting this manure for free all these years. And it became a big thing because the police were now very involved, and it made the newspapers. And this was a big problem because the guy who'd stolen the manure was actually a pretty prominent person. He was a professor at Harvard. It was actually Martin Weitzman, the same economic environmental economist I told you about earlier, who had done the calculation on climate change. And it was a real mess. And finally, they got it worked out. But by then, it had gotten in the papers, and it was embarrassing. It was terrible. And the only upside was that when it was over, Marty Weitzman got an email from one of his colleagues. And it said, "Dear Marty, I read about you in the newspaper." He said, "Congratulations. Most of us economists are net exporters of horse shit, and you, it seems, are a net importer. So thank you for making all of us look slightly better." And this is what I think about all day and night. I hope I've given you something to think about as well. And Fritz, I'm ready for some questions if you have them. Thank you.